Welcome to today's webinar, Fidelio's webinar, from board evaluation to performance review. We're delighted, this is our first webinar of 2024, and I think it's on a very important subject. It's a theme that we've discussed regularly in the course of our work, and we can see a lot of change happening in the board review, board evaluation space. And so we thought we'd just capture our thoughts and some of the trends that we're seeing and share them with you today. We also look forward to your questions. We've received a few in advance, and we'll make sure that we have time to address those. Next chart, please. So today, we'd like to take you through, first of all, some broad background trends in terms of board evaluation. And I should say from the get-go, we're thinking not just in a UK context, but also more broadly. And then the second part of the webinar will be some deep dives around technology and analysis, the shareholder perspective, and the board as a team. And my colleagues will take us through those sessions. And if we, in fact, click onto the next chart, we can see, I'll lead through the first section. Alisa will talk about analysis and technology. Irina will focus on the shareholder perspective. And Joanna is going to talk us through the board as a team, which I think is quite an interesting concept and very, very sort of current in terms of how board evaluation and board reviews are developing. Next chart, please. Just a little bit about us. Fidelio founded 15 years ago, and a singular focus on board effectiveness. We work across evaluation, development and search. And in that context, you'll see that we have a lot of different perspectives on what's working and how that thinking about effectiveness is changing in the boardroom. We also have conversations in the context of our work from a number of different shareholder and stakeholder perspectives. And I flagged here Chapter 0, FTSE Women Leaders, all of which has an effect and an influence on how we think about board evaluation. Next chart, please. And I'd like to just start the overall umbrella of board evaluation with a comment about the prevalence. What really started off as a tool to give comfort to shareholders for listed companies has spread far beyond that. It continues to be a really important tool, and it's something we'll come back to, how shareholders gain comfort from board evaluation. But it's also being used much more broadly, and we're seeing board evaluations being adopted by subsidiary companies, private equity investors conducting board evaluations and board reviews in portfolio companies. Regulators are certainly looking for regular board reviews, even of businesses that are not listed. Major non-profit organisations are without a doubt adopting this framework and intervention, again, to give comfort, I think, to key stakeholders, but also very much with a view of increasing effectiveness, and academic organisations. So across the board, we're seeing that sort of a shift from a very narrow focus on listed companies to a much broader focus that this is part of the sort of the armoury, the toolkit of enhancing board effectiveness. And I should also say that the UK has probably been a forerunner in terms of board evaluation and has implemented that focus of the once every 3 years an external board evaluation, moving into 2 internal evaluations in the intervening years. But we're also seeing this in most jurisdictions now. And it may be that the language is slightly different. It may be in some jurisdictions that it's recommended rather than mandated. And it may be that the rhythm is not as clearly prescribed as it is in the UK. But we are seeing from India to the US, across Europe, in South Africa, for example, we're absolutely seeing this tool of board evaluation being used much more effectively. Next chart, please. I don't propose to go through the refreshed code here today. We have published on this, and we can share links to this. But you will recall that the UK code was refreshed earlier this year, and there were changes which perhaps were on the lighter side of original expectations. These focused on the more explicit requirement for board oversight of risk management and internal controls. The governance reporting is required to focus on board decisions and the outcome of those decisions. So you're getting a more sort of practical focus and a more outcome-based focus. Boards are expected to monitor and assess culture and how the desired culture is being embedded. The board's requirement to promote diversity, inclusion and equality, but the references to specific diverse groups has been dropped, and there's a wide-ranging approach has been encouraged. Board evaluation is now referred to as board performance review, and the code has stipulated malice and clawback provisions. But the point I'd really like to focus on is board evaluation now referred to as board performance review. This has been, I think, largely underreported, and I think that we're probably at the beginning of really working through what this means for boards. Traditionally, we've thought about executive teams and performance, and we've thought about boards much more in the context of effectiveness. But there's a much sharper focus here on performance, and I think this is something we propose to explore today, and I know your questions that have been coming in have focused very much on this point. Next chart, please. I'd like to make just a couple of observations before I hand over to my colleagues. And the first is that we've also seen a shift from chairs accepting the board effectiveness review as a regulatory requirement or a quasi-regulatory requirement to actually this is quite a useful tool. And I think, you know, one of the areas of evolution that we've seen over the recent years is a real shift from that sort of need to do it to how to derive value from this. One of the trends that we're seeing is that chairs are spending more time upfront participating in a sort of a scoping and the preparation of the board evaluation to make sure that it's actually not just giving comfort to shareholders and stakeholders, but also practically supporting the board in becoming increasingly effective. And I guess the levers or the determinants of that scoping are typically around timing. This is an area that we do see boards are prepared to explain rather than comply. You know, if there's a chair transition or a particular event, we often see that the board evaluation will be held around that. Not always, it can be held in the middle, but that is one area of timing. The scope is undoubtedly an area of consideration for the chair. The structure, I mean, particularly if it's a large organisation, how specific and detailed do you want the sort of subsidiary coverage to be and consideration to be? And I know in some, particularly financial services boards, we would conduct very specific subsidiary evaluations as part of a group exercise. But also committees, and committees are normally included, but there may be in-depth perspective on one or other committee. The number of interviewees, typically the whole board is interviewed, and that will be expected, but also a number of the executive team, potentially the entire ExCo. And we have also, and I know others who do the work that we do, may interview stakeholders, the internal auditor, other sort of employees that have a particular perspective on the board. And then the third point is just emphasis. And I think for most chairs, there's very often a couple of areas that are really important to develop. That may be around succession planning, it often is, but it may also be around the strategic process, for example. And I think, you know, we're really seeing chairs sort of lean in and make sure that they're really deriving the full value without inappropriately influencing the board evaluation. Next chart, please. We will talk about the tools today, and I would say that there's a broader range of tools and applications for conducting board evaluation. Obviously the interviews, but a number of other surveys, questionnaires, observations. But I think what we're really seeing is a desire to really distill what's important. The chair recently said to me, it's just cutting through the noise. There is so much that's being written about governance. There's so much discussion, there's so much change, there's so much complexity in other aspects. That cutting through the noise is really important. And essentially, if we really sort of drill down, what is the purpose of the board evaluation? It's asking really fundamental questions. Is the board having effective discussions about the right topics? And how is the work of the board supported by the composition, the dynamic, and the processes? And I think one thing you should be looking for, and we find is really important, is to be able to distill the data points, the insights, and bring them down to practical findings that will help to address those questions. Next chart, please. Now, obviously, each board evaluation is distinct, and they are designed, as I've alluded to shape, to reflect the priorities of that particular board at that particular time. There will also be very specific sectoral issues that will apply, for example, in extractives that will be very different from financial services. But we are seeing some themes that very much recur across board evaluations and across sectors, and indeed across geographies as well. And currently, I would say some of the themes that are really coming to the surface in the work that we're doing and the work that we see others doing as well are, firstly, the application and governance of AI. Now, obviously, what this means for the business, for the company, but also what this means for the board. And the governance of AI is undoubtedly a theme that we're seeing occurring more and more in terms of our board discussions. The second point is politics, policy, and uncertainty. And the board plays a very specific and important role in helping to navigate the organisation and navigate the political uncertainty and certainly the policy uncertainty, if you think, for example, with vis-a-vis climate. And so that's a theme, how the board can exercise influence in this area. The narrative for shareholders and stakeholders, we are finding that, perhaps what started in the US as a backlash against some of the ESG requirements and aspirations that were being very broadly embraced, has come to the UK, and we're seeing that a number of boards are having discussions with both shareholders and stakeholders about how to bring those expectations together, how to align expectations. And that's a theme that we're certainly seeing, that sort of weighting of shareholder and stakeholder expectations. And last but absolutely not least, culture was mentioned by the code, and we're certainly seeing the focus on culture, the focus on the people agenda has really, it continues to increase, and that the board has the visibility that it needs, that the board has the engagement that it needs. Next chart, please. And I think just a sort of a final point in this section, we're also seeing, reflecting that point I made earlier, that this is no longer a sort of a one-off intervention that takes place once every 3 years, but much more focus on continuous improvement in the boardroom, in continuous enhancement of effectiveness. And so one of the things that we're seeing, and I know others are seeing as well, is that much more thought is being given, firstly, to following up on the recommendations, embedding the findings of the external board evaluation. And we typically see that upwards of 80% of the recommendations that are made are embedded. So it's very much working with the grain. But the second point is also the use of those internal evaluations or reviews. We're definitely seeing that boards are using these in a more muscular way. It's much less of a sort of a just filling in a quick questionnaire, absolutely not. And the internal review will obviously look at all aspects of governance, typically look at progress on the implementation of recommendations from the external review. But also we're seeing thematic deep dives, and a couple that we've worked on have been around the high-performing board. What is it that constitutes a high-performing board? and on strategy and the board's contribution to the strategy process. So we're seeing quite a shift there as well in terms of focus. Now, I'd like to move on. Next chart, please. And I'm going to hand over at this stage, you've heard enough of me speaking, to my colleague, Alistair. And I've asked Alistair to look at analysis and technology and how that underpins board evaluation, undoubtedly an area where we are seeing a lot of innovation and a lot of development. So Alistair, if I may, can I hand over to you?
Yes, certainly. Thank you, Gillian. I want to pick back up on the point that Gillian made a couple of slides back, and this is, what do chairs look for from board evaluations? And she's absolutely right. They're looking for, like, what are the key issues? So we're very often, asked to really distill the work that we do into a relatively small number of what should be hard-hitting recommendations. And to do this effectively requires a kind of combination, what I think of as a combination of kind of art and science, in that, you have to capture the big picture issues of board performance. But increasingly, if you're going to come up with practical and valuable recommendations, there needs to be some solid analytics behind that. And so, firms like ourselves who work in board evaluation have spent time creating analytical frameworks which focus on, what does board performance really mean? And there are four kind of key drivers of this, which is composition, process information, and the board dynamics. And so the frameworks are aimed to try and piece that apart so that when you come to recommendations, there are some very clear and practical things that need to be done that can improve the performance of the board. Now, Fidelio, we have a 15-point framework. Other evaluation frameworks are available from other companies. And we've done quite a lot of work and investment behind those frameworks, ensuring that we can, through the board evaluation, come up with recommendations that can be implemented and can make a difference and will actually move the performance of the board forward. At the moment, for example, we're investing quite a lot in the last of those categories within kind of dynamics and behaviors. My colleague Joanna, who is going to, I think, follow me or in a couple of slides anyway, is leading that kind of development of analysis in that area, so that we can be even sort of clearer about how we can improve the dynamics of the board, or what recommendations we can make to improve board dynamics. I think it's important to say, though, that while science and analysis are playing an increasingly important role in the way that reviews are constructed and put together, the art side of this, the art of an effective interview, is still core to our approach. And that is the best way of really drawing out what's happening in the board remains the interview. And certainly from a Fidelio perspective, our board evaluations will always include that as the core of the evaluation. The second thing that I want to talk about a little bit is technology, and many people, many of our clients ask, are you using AI? How can we use AI to improve the quality of board evaluations? And so my view really is that, will technology or AI impact board performance review? It certainly will. And if we look at some of our kind of related fields, we're seeing applications already out there in the marketplace that could have a read across into board evaluation. So things like document analysis, transcript analysis, work on benchmarking, work on capturing performance trends and forecasting those. We see those already being used in other areas. We are somewhat cautious in adopting these things immediately, because it's very, very critical that the confidentiality of the data that we receive in the board evaluation, remains confidential. So a number of applications which require, data to be put out more into either the public domain or into a domain that another company is involved in, we're avoiding that. But it's inevitable, I think, that we will start to see some of these tools become involved in board evaluations over the next year or so. If we're going forward, I think there are a lot of areas where, when we look at what is developing in AI and what types of tools are being developed in AI, that we will we'll see some of these things coming into play as well. As Gillian mentioned, we are increasingly now being asked to play a role with the board in terms of a kind of ongoing performance kind of oversight. So, looking at, measuring performance improvement, advice and implementation, working with boards on those sort of interim reviews that are now, so much part of the UK code. And I think in those areas, we're also going to start to see AI tools available that will actually help make that a kind of more powerful type of relationship. And that would be, around performance monitoring, but also things like decision support and decision-making tools. I think we will start to see coming into that ongoing process of monitoring how well boards are doing and how good board performance is. And I'd just like to end on the final section in terms of, like, if we look out into the future, one of the key roles that we set out for, or the way that we see boards adding value, is in exercising judgment. And we're currently doing some research work into what we've called the board's judgment muscle, in terms of how do boards do that, how can boards be more effective at exercising judgment. And I think there's little doubt that there's a number of tools, a number of AI tools that will be able to enhance the board's judgment muscle. The boards will be able to use those alongside their own processes to enhance their ability to exercise judgment. And I think one of the questions, I guess, if we're looking into the more distant future, is, will AI ever be able to replace the board's judgment muscle? Will we start to see AI playing an active role in actually making some of the board's decisions, as opposed to supporting the kind of human beings who are sitting around the boardroom table? With that slightly frightening kind of prospect of the future, I'll hand back to Gillian to continue.
Thank you, Alistair. And I think just that AI concept, I mean, our house view, and certainly my personal view, is what makes us distinctively human is judgment and our ability to exercise judgment. And I think the board will always have that, always need to bring that to bear. But obviously, how the board prepares and informs itself, and the decision, the data that comes to the board, AI, we're already seeing, is playing a big role. And in fact, the discussion that we're having on AI currently with boards is very much around governance, and how does the board oversee the use of AI in the business? What are the frameworks? What are the safety, the balances, the checks? And we've already conducted a couple of webinars and research on this, but I think that's going to be a key focal point, is that sort of governance of AI. Thank you. Let's move on to the next deep dive. And this is the shareholder perspective. And I think, I started off by saying that, put simply and crudely, board evaluations came about to give comfort to shareholders, that it was a sort of a tool for once every 3 years, shareholders could take comfort that the board was being assessed by an external party, an independent party. So let's just think, what is it that shareholders really want from board evaluations, and how well do board evaluations meet that need? So if I could hand over to my colleague, Irina. Welcome, and Irina.
Thank you, Gillian. So shareholders do care about board reviews, but they may not be able to derive full value from it. Investors, and certainly long-term minded investors, do want to see the boards contributing to strategy, contributing to capital allocation, remuneration, because those are the attributes and the components that feed directly to valuations. However, assessing how well the boards do on those topics might not be as straightforward, and could be quite challenging, because simply the board doesn't, the investors don't have the full visibility of the board involvement in this. And investors typically would have to work through what's available to them, and that's usually the composition. Do we have the breadth and the diversity of backgrounds and experience? Do we have the right people on the board, as well as through the corporate governance section of the annual report? That, however, is changing, and investors are starting to use the board review more proactively, getting more insight of what's really on the board agenda and what the challenges could be. And as the investors get more visibility, they also would like to get more discussion around those topics. And in the future, we are very likely to see that the board performance review will generate this kind of discussion and involvement and engagement with the shareholders around the report itself, but also around the questions of strategy, of remuneration. Because in the eyes of shareholders, the board review is that element that gives the comfort to shareholders that there is a true alignment of interest, that the shareholders and the company are on the same page in a lot of topics. And the board is providing the effective oversight and guidance. Back to you, Gillian.
Thank you, Irina. I think it's really interesting that, how shareholders consume the board evaluation review, and obviously the disclosure and the reporting is an important piece of that. And we are seeing that reporting is becoming more and more, I guess, insightful. And I think shareholders are beginning to wake up to that, that there is something here to interrogate and to understand. The other aspect I should mention, I did allude to it earlier, is while the majority of board evaluations are commissioned by the board, by the company itself, we are seeing board evaluations also being commissioned by regulators and by investors and shareholders. To date, that's still probably quite a small portion of the overall body of board evaluation work that's being done. But I think it has the potential to be a growing trend. And, these would probably be structured in a different way. And there are some challenges around that, which we may want to go into sort of afterwards as to whether working with the board or it's being done to the board. But it is something to be aware of, that there is also a universe of sort of board evaluation that's not just commissioned by the board and by the company itself. I'd like to now come to our third deep dive. And this is the subject of the board as a team. And I think, we're all aware of bringing together highly experienced people and trying to ensure that you're making the best use of their time, and that the whole is much greater, than the sum of the parts, that there is a real sort of value of bringing these people together. And I'd like to welcome Joanna to talk us through how thinking through what constitutes a team can be valuable in this context. So Joanna, welcome.
Thank you, Gillian. So we're going to discuss the board as a team. And before we go into that, let's just stop for a moment and think about what is a team. And I think for simplicity, I would just say a team is a group of people who share a common purpose, as opposed to a group of individuals who are sort of simply coordinating. So there's something quite distinctive about a team. And we're going to consider the board as a team as the next step in evaluating the board. And I'm also going to talk about some of the learnings that we take from our experience of team dynamics, which could be taken into the boardroom to improve team dynamics. So, as Gillian said, when we meet in the boardroom, we bring together a group of very experienced, intelligent people, and they're there to have some very high quality conversations. They're there to exercise good judgment on the issues before them. And they need timely and effective meetings. They need to draw on strong interpersonal relationships. They need a very good understanding of how they can work together, what each other's strengths are. They need to have good lines of communication. And very importantly, they need to be able to challenge each other's thinking and contribute effectively to make sure that the overall outcome is the optimal outcome for the organization or business that they are working for. So in other words, this group of people, this team, the board, need to come together as a very, very robust team. And so we need to think about how we can evaluate the board as a team and how we can structure recommendations and development to help to advance and enhance that capacity. And I mean, based on best practice and experience that we have, observation is frequently used. We will very often sit with the board and observe the interactions as they play out. So we might be looking for the way in which members of the board engage. We might be looking at the attitudes they present to each other. We'll be looking at their listening skills. How well do they listen to each other? Do they interrupt each other? How do they deal with issues of difficulty or conflict? All of this can be observed and examined through the board evaluation observation process. Another approach, which Alistair mentioned, is the in-depth interview. These provide qualitative insights into what's going on with individual members of the board and the board potentially as a whole. Very often confidential interviews are designed in a bespoke way with a bespoke questionnaire designed to ascertain views on key issues, to look at the quality of relationships, to look at the quality of communication and engagement, and to get assessments of the board dynamic and the areas for improvement. And then thirdly, we get a lot of intelligence and insights and deeper understanding from the observation work and the in-depth interviews, but it's very important that we use a structured approach to feed back those insights and those learnings. So we encourage people to use structured feedback with individual board members to ensure that the learnings can be taken from the evaluation process. So I'm going to move on now and just look at some of the learnings that we can take from team dynamics to understand some of the key elements that contribute to an effective board dynamic. And I'm just going to look at 5 elements. So first of all, clarity of role. It's essential in any team that each member knows exactly what his or her role entails. And similarly, in the boardroom, it's very important that everybody knows what their role is, including their fiduciary duties and the expectations around those. Therefore, the recruitment process, the training, the induction of new board members are all important. But most important of all is how the individual's knowledge and understanding of their role manifests in their behaviour. Secondly, mutual respect and trust. Board engagement should ideally be based on mutual respect for colleagues and bonds of trust which develop and strengthen over time. Mutual respect is something that develops into bonds of trust and fosters candour in board discussions. And it's very important that those bonds of trust are strong enough to withstand different viewpoints around the table and challenge that can come from difficult questions to ensure the process is going to generate an optimal outcome. So overall, we're looking for mutual trust in the board relationships because we want to ensure there's a healthy dynamic of tension, challenge, and candid debate around the board discussion. And board evaluation, particularly the observation and qualitative interview approach, can really help us to examine what trust is like in the boardroom team and how to make recommendations on how to develop it. Thirdly, psychological safety. Psychological safety is about the degree to which individuals in the team feel able to be vulnerable with each other, to be able to move from their zone of comfort to their zone of discomfort. We know from Google's research on teams that a high presence of psychological safety is correlated with highly effective, high-performing teams. And what this means is that there's a diversity of views and challenges encouraged Members of the team can speak freely about the issues which are on their mind and raise questions for the team to consider. Again, there's a healthy degree of tension driving to the best outcomes. And very obviously, with psychological safety, the role of the chair, the engagement of the chair, is absolutely critical in ensuring this. Fourthly, personal excellence and leveraging strengths. We know from Gallup's research into strengths-based leadership and high-performing teams that teams that know and use their strengths every day can achieve excellence, outstanding excellence, and the highest levels of performance. Board members' awareness of each other's unique strengths and how to leverage these is likely to drive high levels of team performance and the best outcomes for the organisation. So we need to look at how we can use evaluation where there is an opportunity for the board to benefit from work that's been done on team dynamics with executive teams, to use this and to look at how we can develop pathways for development for individuals and the board as a whole. And then finally, continuous learning and feedback. Boards need to continuously exercise great judgment, and the board dynamic is continuously in a state of flux. So feedback on a regular basis is going to be very, very important. Feedback in the form of evaluation, training, and individual and team development. The board evaluation process can accommodate feedback on these softer skills and the team dynamic. And that means the board evaluation process can help us to create some optimal development pathways for the individual members of the board and the board as a whole.
Thank you, Joanna. And this is, I think, the sort of the latter deep dive, an area we're seeing a tremendous amount of focus, and essentially building great judgment and that sort of great decision-making capability is predicated on the strength of the team and the collective ability of the team. So I think this is a really interesting area, and we're seeing a great deal of focus on that. We've talked a great deal, but we would like to answer your questions. We do have questions coming in, so please just use the Q&A function, and we'll continue to answer them. The first question I'd like to address was just a clarification on the use of the word interview versus questionnaire. And certainly in our nomenclature and the Fidelio sort of terminology, but I think possibly for other firms as well, the interview is a one-on-one discussion. For us, the interviews typically take an hour and a half with the chair. I think Alistair referred to our framework of open questions, and we would typically start the interview with a discussion of how the board contributes value, and then work through other dimensions of governance. But I think it's really important that those interviews are enjoyable, interesting, stimulating, thought-provoking. They shouldn't be formulaic. And I think it's a really important part, as Alistair mentioned, of its absolute core to the external board evaluation. I think that, and Alistair may want to just add a little bit on the questionnaires that supplement this. So Alistair, if I could just hand over to you.
Yeah, I mean, we as I did mention, I think it's absolutely right. The kind of art of conducting a good, interesting, open interview is really, really core to our process, and that really is how we can really draw out kind of insights into what's really going on in the board table. We do have, as I said, when we do a board evaluation, which is, sorry, I should get used to saying a board performance review. We do use a lot of other techniques, and we do use some questionnaires, and we will typically use questionnaires to reinforce some of the kind of key points that we cover in the interviews, because running the two together is quite helpful. So we'll often use a quantitative survey, which are where we ask people to rank the performance of the board in certain areas, and use that alongside our transcript of the kind of open interview, where we get a lot more flavour for what's happening. But together they help us to pinpoint those areas that are most, where either most sort of concern or need most development in the board. So I think using the two together can be extremely helpful.
Thank you. And I think one thing that's really important is just using board members' time well. Filling in long sort of questionnaires may not be a good use of board members' time, but a sort of a succinct and quite sharp use of questionnaires can be a good use of time. There's an excellent question here, which I'd like to come to. Do we see a difference on how we conduct board evaluations for operating versus investment trust boards, public versus private companies, and supervisory two-tiered boards versus one tier, the unitary board that we find in the UK? I'd perhaps like to say a couple of words, and then I'll open up to my colleagues. Obviously, when you're conducting a board evaluation, you need to understand the governance framework, the statutory framework, the code, if there is a code, the legal underpinning, the remit of the board, and that needs to be understood. So we would always make sure that we'd taken, we'd done real due diligence to make sure that we understood that thoroughly. Equally, a core component of our approach to board evaluation, and I think in all effective board evaluation, is it's the board's contribution to value. It's the board's contribution to the value equation. So how is the board adding value? How is the board supporting the objectives of the organisation, be it a non-profit, be it a two-tier board, be it a listed board in the UK? And I think you need those two dimensions. And actually, a lot of the tools and the structure can work very well. I think, as a general statement, UK boards are much more familiar with board evaluation and therefore can sort of enter into it and engage with it. And it might not be so familiar in other jurisdictions. But I think provided there's a really robust understanding of what the legal structure is, what the framework is, you can use quite similar approaches and tools to really develop very meaningful outcomes. You do need to understand which levers are available to the board, what the remit of the board is, and in that context, you can really probe how the board's adding value and the effectiveness that the board brings. I don't know if any of my colleagues would like to pick up on that point. I don't know, Alistair, you've worked with me on it.
I was just going to pick up on I've done quite a lot of work with private equity portfolio company boards, and interestingly, they're not typically used to going by the code or whatever it is. Many of them are not domiciled here in the UK. But it was the way to actually think about it for a board like that is exactly as you said, is to say, actually, we're going to start by understanding how the board adds value and what role is the board playing. And also, often with private equity, what role can the board play in satisfying kind of potential buyers of these companies out forward, that the company has been run effectively and well and hasn't actually been, just sort of drained of all of its all of its resources. And so, it gives you a very good insight, when you're talking to a board that does not have a code to fall back on, does not have a kind of traditional kind of, listing. It really brings home the fact of where can the board add value, and what do you as a portfolio company board add to this? Why are you sitting there, sitting over the top of a company which is really being kind of driven by one single owner? So I think it kind of reinforces your point that actually whatever board you go to, if you go back to the fundamentals of what is the board there for and what value is it adding, then the whole process makes sense to even people who are not used to working with code. And
I think the outcomes, the recommendations to make the work to help the board be more effective in its work is something that's appealing to boards in all jurisdictions, but also to shareholders and stakeholders in all jurisdictions. We've really got another question building on from that, and that's, do you observe differences in the maturity of board evaluations in different markets, what is done and how it's reported, UK versus Europe versus the US? And I mean, perhaps just a word from my side, and then I'll open it up to my colleagues. I do think that the UK has made a lot of progress here, and it's much more commonplace. We see a very high level of acceptance of board evaluation, and actually we also see, as I mentioned, a lot of chairs really leaning into board evaluation and working with the grain. Having said that, I've also worked with chairs across different jurisdictions in Europe, in India, and the US, where they've taken this very seriously. And I've seen some pretty kind of innovative thinking in those jurisdictions as well. But broadly speaking, I sort of stick to my point that I think the UK probably has made more progress than other markets, because it's, this is more commonplace. In terms of maturity, it is interesting. I mean, I think one thing that will drive that is what Irina alluded to, is the expectations of shareholders and the expectations of stakeholders as well. And I think we could begin to see quite a lot of, the pace picking up. As we said, private equity's sort of already using board evaluation, but we are also beginning to see in different markets listed companies use board evaluation in a more sort of muscular way. But I'd like to just turn to Irina, because Irina's also invested across many markets, and just wearing your sort of broader hat, as it were, Irina, your perspective on the maturity of board evaluation.
I think it's a very, very interesting subject, and as investors, in particular long-term investors, evaluate the business, it's really the complexity of all the parts that come together, and board, and how effectively the board does in providing this oversight and guidance to the business. That becomes an integral part of how the investors see the business, and that again provides a bridge to how the business is valued. And so the maturity of it comes into very directly, I would say, to how the market sees the business, sees the company, and through that, how it sees the board's involvement and executive involvement, but in this context of our discussion, the board involvement and the effectiveness of it for the proposition of the business and its value.
Thank you. I mean, it really is interesting. It's that value contribution to the value equation linked to valuation. I mean, there's obviously a number of steps there, and but all that we've been talking about today is a number of different parties looking at the work of the board and trying to understand as much as possible what that connection is. And I think that's one of the reasons this is such an interesting area. We've got a couple more really good questions. The next one I'd like to come to Joanna, and this is really incorporating a board evaluation with a skills matrix skill gap to lead to succession planning. And I'll probably bring Alistair in as well on this. I mean, I would say that in most board evaluations, this is a really important theme. The skill matrix today, how well aligned it is to the business and to the needs of the business, identifying gaps and contributing to ongoing succession planning, as well as sort of looking to the work of the NOMCO, for example. But Joanna, just in terms of that team, there's one aspect is the skill matrix, one aspect is the cohesion of the team. Any thoughts on that sort of how the board evaluation can play into the board's understanding of succession planning and the gaps that it may well have in its skill matrix today?
Well, I thank you, Gillian. I think that it's a very interesting area, and certainly an area that is in development. I think there is a trend towards more measurement around the skills matrix, and looking at people's competencies and being able to compare and contrast those skills and competencies. And so what you see is greater use of tools like Hogan in succession planning, or in consideration of what skills people have in the team around the board table. And I think that's probably set to continue. It's about bringing some science and some data alongside the qualitative work which is being done, which is very important. And I would always say that you probably need to look at both. Some data can help drive a richer conversation and greater insights, but you need to marry it up with the qualitative assessment that the individual makes about their skills, their competencies, and what is going on for them or what they are observing in the group. So I think it's a combination is probably the way forward, but I think we will see more people reaching and looking for some data and some science to help them answer those really important questions.
Thank you. And I think that's spot on. And, you know, practically what you should be seeing from any board evaluation is feedback on how well aligned the skill matrix is today to the needs of the business. You should be identifying gaps that have been identified by your board members, as well as, you know, any perceptions that we would bring or the evaluator would bring from other work that's being done, and structuring that in a way that the NOMCO can take that away. And, you know, we would make recommendations and feedback, but it's for the NOMCO obviously to then prioritise and feed that into succession planning. But it absolutely should be it should be a useful tool for succession planning. And we do find that it's used in that way. And your expectation should be that. We've got a question here on evaluation of committees, and is this a new trend? I mean, I think committees, we've certainly been evaluating committees for a long period of time, but I think it's a broadening trend. I think there is an acceptance that any board evaluation would typically, you know, include an evaluation of the committees, as well as some very in-depth evaluations, and at times it might be just of the committee. Where we see this most developed is in financial services, and we've done very detailed work on how subsidiary committees feed into group committees and the flow of information. But I think, you know, the committees do so much heavy lifting for the board. You would only get a partial picture if you didn't take that into account. I'm just going to hand over to Alistair there if you'd like to add anything, because I know we've done quite a lot of work in this space.
Yeah, no, we do a lot of committee evaluations. I think, you know, one of the areas that we're often looked at is where you've got a relatively new committee or a committee whose role is not particularly well defined. So in audit committee, it's really well established what that committee does. But in committees, particularly around things like sustainability or ESG committees, where many companies are putting that in place to try and help move that kind of issue forward, there's not so much experience about, you know, how best to use that committee, how best to use that committee's time, how it relates into the board. And so we found in lots of occasions we can really help companies understand how best to set up the sustainability committee, what they should get themselves involved in, and how they should relate to the main board and the overall ESG strategy of the company. So that's another area where committee reviews are becoming more common because companies are looking to people to help them actually make those committees effective.
Thank you. We've also had an observation on AI and about the use of AI, and that, you know, at the end of the day, I mentioned that judgment is you know, what makes us human, and it's really important for the board to bring judgment, but also for us to bring judgment. And thank you for the comment. I mean, absolutely. You know, all these things we've mentioned are tools, and, you know, at the end of the day, you want a considered opinion and a thoughtful opinion as to how effective the board is being. I mean, essentially, I see the way that we're using AI as similar to many board members, and I'd be interested in, you know, your collective feedback on this. But it's almost like another data point, another source, perhaps bringing up different ideas, but absolutely not taking those ideas at face value. You know, challenging them, but being able to see things from different perspectives, and this will clearly evolve. But I come back to the point that, you know, that Alistair made, judgment is what's really important. And, you know, it's what we bring, and it's what you as board members or you as investors, and I know we have investors on the call, bring to, you know, the role that you're doing. It's an extra source, but it's, you know, that's what's really important here. Now, I think we're just going to we're moving to the top of the hour. So could we just perhaps move on to the final couple of charts? So really just wrapping up from our side, the board review, it's evolving very, very fast. We're seeing really innovative thinking about how board effectiveness can be increased, but also how it can be assessed and reviewed. Absolutely linked to the value equation, the point that Irina made, that sort of link with valuation and value, shareholders and stakeholders, really important. Drawing upon the different aspects of analysis, and I hope we've been able to share that with you today, that you're looking at soft analysis, you're looking at data points, you're looking at valuation. There's a number of different themes that can be woven into this, but then really distilling, cutting through the noise. How is the board adding value, and how can the board add more value? I think shareholders and stakeholders are becoming more sophisticated in how they're using board reviews, board performance reviews, and then really mandating and overseeing and participating in board reviews. We're seeing this as a sort of absolutely a skill for chairs, but also for board members more broadly. Often the SID is commissioning as well, or there may be a NOMCO or REMCO contribution. So really, this is part of board life, and we are seeing, particularly in the UK, but more broadly, that boards are really beginning to embrace this. Next slide, please. And really, just looking ahead, we've mentioned diversity several times through today's discussion, and we were delighted to be accredited for the 7th time by the FTSE Women Leaders Review for our contribution to gender diversity in boardrooms beyond the 350, so looking at the UK and internationally, reflecting our footprint. The judgment muscle is research that we're undertaking, and if any of you are interested in contributing to that research, please do get in touch. We're really compiling some quite interesting perspectives on how chairs are building boards that really have great judgment and great decision-making capability. And our other focus is REM. This is going to be quite an interesting REM season, and so we're looking at the research findings that we issued last year as boards and REMCOs go into the REM season, the AGM season this year, particularly those with a policy, with a REM policy, which will be up for consideration. Well, I'd like to thank all of you for your questions today, super questions. I'd like to thank my colleagues for their contribution, and the team who helped us prepare this sort of summary of what we're seeing in terms of board evaluation. Please don't hesitate to get in touch if you have any further questions, if you'd like to follow up on any of these points. Our contact details are available. We'll share the charts with you so that you have them. And once again, from our side, many thanks. It's been a pleasure discussing this topic, and we really look forward to seeing how this continues to evolve. It's a very exciting space to be in. So thank you all very much.